Welcome to the Andrew Holland Podcast, where we talk about business, entrepreneurship, and everything in between. Now, here's your host, Andrew Holland.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Andrew Holland Podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Holland. I'm a businessman. I'm an entrepreneur. I'm a CPA that's worked in the corporate world, and I've worked in the financial services and the investment industry. I've also started multiple businesses and currently run multiple businesses. Some of those businesses have had multi-million dollars in revenue, and I've sold businesses with multi-million dollar valuations. You can find more out about my background in multiple places. Our website, theandrewhollandpodcast.com. On Twitter, my handle is @HollandPodcast. That's @Holland Podcast. And of course, our YouTube channel, the Andrew Holland Podcast. On those three different sources, we also talk outside of the podcast about everything that we talk about in the podcast and so much more. So subscribe to our YouTube channel to get updated notifications when the video version of the podcast comes out every Wednesday. And of course, follow me on Twitter so that we can continue the conversation and have fun, talk about business outside the podcast. Thank you so much for joining us each and every week, every Wednesday, to talk about business, entrepreneurship, and everything in between. The last couple of episodes, we've had some incredible entrepreneurs that have shared their stories, the struggles, the successes, the failures. So this week, I want to take an opportunity to take a step back, reflect about some of the things that they've said, and then really focus on helping individuals think about, whether it's you or someone you know, if you want to start a business, where do you start? One of the key things that we heard from every single guest that we've had thus far is taking that leap, moving from maybe a standard corporate job to jumping into owning your own business is incredibly scary. It can be very frightening, and it can be very lonely. But the first step, and we've heard from every single one of them, Alex, the car dealer, reminded us, execute, 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 execute. There's so many people that talk about, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do this. It's all talk. They take no action, and you can't get anywhere. You can't build something successful unless if you take action. Darren from last week, one of the most fun podcasts I've done to date and the best conversation, basically woke up one morning and said, I'm quitting. I'm quitting my successful construction job. He turned to his wife and said, I'm just done. I'm not fulfilled. So I want to think about those particular scenarios. Those are big jumps, and it's easy to talk about, but it's really, really hard to do. So what steps can you take to make it a little bit easier to actually help push you into action? Because we're all humans. It's natural to be afraid to take that leap. I remember during about year 5 of the garbage business, we had grown to the point where I had to leave a very successful career in the financial services industry. I was moving up. There was tons of opportunity to continue moving up, would have likely had to move to a different city, probably Chicago, and I was more than willing to do that, if that was my goal, moving up the corporate ladder. But it wasn't. As a reminder, I had stayed within the financial services industry because my business partner, Jeff, was outside running the business full time. I was, of course, working 50 to 60 hours in the financial services industry at a bank because my earning potential was higher and we desperately needed the cash to grow the garbage company. But when we got to the point where it was starting to cash flow, it could sustain itself from the revenue from its operations, and it needed another human being, not just any human being, but another owner involved, that's when I had to make the leap. And it's a little bit different. I don't want to say it wasn't scary, but the real scary part for me and for Jeff, I think, was starting the business, because we knew that we weren't both going to be able to quit our jobs right away because that would have been foolish. We really would have died. As a reminder, we had financed the business on credit cards, so we had payments there that we had to make, and the business certainly wasn't going to do that. But I understand that feeling of fearfulness. If you think back to, again, referencing Darren, the owner and founder of Flock Audio, he was in a successful construction company and he was moving up the ladder, but on the side, he was a relatively successful recording artist. And so he had what you would consider a hobby at that point, even though he was earning some money. And so he didn't just up and quit his job with nothing established upon which to build off of. If you remember, and if you listen back on episode 9, when he decided to quit, he and his wife, Jessica, put a bunch of their money and built out their basement into a recording studio. And he had made connections within the music industry so that he knew he would have some revenue upon which to rely. So that's a perfect example of where if you want to start a business, you're afraid to make that jump, you can start establishing at least some roots in the industry in which you want to operate so that when you finally decide this is the time for me to really go full hog into my business, you have some semblance of a foundation. So we're going to talk about, and there's a lot of considerations, but we're going to focus on 5 key considerations this week that I think if you are in that position where you know you're entrepreneurial motivated, or you have friends or family, or there's a collection of you and you want to start something, but you're just not sure, what do I do? How do I think about this? How do I get myself to be more comfortable acting and actually taking that step? I want to talk about 5 considerations that you can think about that will maybe get you in the mindset where you can say, okay, I'm not doing this on a whim. I've thought about this. This is the industry I want to go into. I want to start something. How do I know what to start? This is what I can start to at least get you a little bit more comfortable. Now, the reality of the situation is there's nothing that I'm going to say. There's nothing that anybody's going to say to you. There's nothing you're going to read that's going to physically pick you up off that couch, take you out of your life cycle that you're currently in, and force you to act. You're the only one that can get yourself to act. But as all of us entrepreneurs talk, connect, we can share stories and thoughts and ideas that help you wrap your mind around getting more comfortable upon taking action. You know, they say that planning and preparation is 99% of achieving any successful goal or accomplishing anything. And think about that. If you have to give a big speech, if you're thrown into giving a big speech and you've had no time to plan or prepare, it's a lot more nerve-wracking than if you're given an opportunity, and I'm just using an example for a big speech because a lot of people tend to be afraid of public speaking, then if you're given the opportunity to plan, prepare, have some idea of what you're going to say. Now, the anticipation can be incredibly terrifying until you actually get on that stage and realize it's okay, but when you know what you want to talk about, when you've had an opportunity to plan and prepare, it makes it a little bit easier. And so I want us to think about starting a business just like that. So let's talk about the 5 key things that will help you think about actually taking some type of action to move forward. So this is what I would consider the planning and preparation stage. This will also help you identify, if you have no idea, what do I want to start? Because we've talked about that. And when I look back at all the businesses that I've started, I skipped a lot of the planning and preparation stages, and I paid for it dearly. Now, the garbage business, for example, we really didn't do any of the planning and preparation that we're going to talk about today, the 5 considerations. And had we might never have gotten into that, or perhaps we would have gotten into it in a much more sustainable, less emotionally, mentally, financially painful manner. Being as that may, we didn't do a lot of these things. We suffered for it, but it turned out okay. So that's to say, you don't have to have everything planned out perfectly. And one of the biggest problems is analysis paralysis. So I don't want today's conversation to be in a reason or an excuse for you to say, well, I haven't planned or prepared enough. No, this is a high level topic conversation. It's to get you to be more comfortable about acting, but you eventually have to act. So let's start with the 5 things that I want to talk about. And they're going to be focused around what business should I start? What industry should I get into? I know I'm entrepreneurially motivated, as I said earlier, but I don't know what to say. I don't know what I want to get into. So, number 1, I want to have a conversation around skills and enjoyment. We'll talk more about that in a bit. Number 2, let's talk about your wallet. Let's talk about financing. Let's talk about why most businesses fail. They don't have the financial means to start or even sustain themselves. And maybe they can start, but oftentimes we under budget the cash needs of a business for the first 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years. So let's talk about that. That can be a huge determinant in what business you want to start or what industry you want to get into. Number 3, location. Tied closely to that is location-based business versus what I call an anywhere business. Location, number 3, is where are you currently located? Where do you live? Is that where you want to live long term? And then similar to that, but not the exact same, and I'll have multiple examples for this, is do I want a location-based business, a restaurant, a retail shop, a furniture store, anything that's based at a location that customers come to you at? Or do I want something that's considered more of an anywhere business, something you could fly across the world and you could still run and do? Now, there's a mixture between those two things, and sometimes you start off as one and you can move into the other with a team. But I think thinking about that well in advance, and I wish it's something I would have thought about well in advance in some of the businesses that I've started, is helpful in making sure that you are laying a foundation that will give you the highest opportunity for success. And again, nothing guarantees success. We all know that. If success was guaranteed, everybody would do it and it'd be nothing. So it's just something to think about. And then the last thing that a lot of people don't think about is scalability. What do you want with a business? So some people, they're happy with one location, growing it to as large of a capacity as one physical location can handle, and just having a modest, reasonable lifestyle with what that one location can provide. Some people want to conquer the world. They want to grow, 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 and they're not satisfied with one location or 2 locations. They want 500 different locations, and maybe the franchise model is good for that, but they want to grow, 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 grow. If it's a service-based business, something online, they want to grow, 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 grow. Your desires may change over time as you get into business, meaning you may be inclined to want to grow, 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 and then you hit a certain level within the business and you think, you know what? I'm happy. The business is going well. I want to grow modestly, but I don't need to conquer the world and rule an empire. So that can change over time, but it's something that's good to think about at the beginning. So to recap, your skills, and I'm going to tap onto that enjoyment, but I'll put a caveat on that. Number 2, your wallet and the financing situation. Number 3, location, where you live. Is it where you want to live? Similar to that, but different. Number 4, location-based business versus a anywhere business. And then number 5, scalability. What do you want with your business? What do you want to accomplish? Those 5 factors, I think, and I know from experience, are a great start. Again, they're not necessarily the end-all be-all, but they're a great start for you to think about and to plan and prepare for, or utilize to plan and prepare for taking action and actually starting a business. So let's start and talk in more depth about number one, skills. As I've talked about in the past, and for those who maybe haven't listened to previous episodes, my business partner Jeff and I got into garbage. We picked up people's trash, but we didn't originally start picking up people's trash on a weekly basis. We got into the roll-off business. That's the big containers that typically is used in the construction industry for projects when you have lots of garbage to throw away. You have 10 yards, 15 yards, 20 yards, 30 yards. You'll see them on construction sites, but we as residential individuals often get them if we want to do a house clean out or if there's an estate sale or what have you. I was a CPA by trade. I was working in Minneapolis as a CPA with Ernst & Young, auditing primarily financial services company. Didn't have a CDL, knew nothing about trash, knew nothing about blue-collar work, period. It just wasn't, I knew nothing. Jeff, on a similar note, was a pilot, a private pilot for a private aviation company out of Eau Claire, Wisconsin. When we got into this particular industry, we knew nothing about it. We didn't get into it because we thought meticulously about it. We basically wanted to start a business. We tried a bunch of things without really thinking. And this was one of those situations where we didn't really think and an opportunity came along and we did a bunch of research and said, sure, let's get into this. Really as young, not very intelligent, pretty naive 23 and 24-year-olds. I've talked about in the past that youth can be can be a really good thing because you're relatively naive and you're just enthusiastic to move forward, but it can also be detrimental because you don't typically do the planning and preparation. Don't let that happen to you. It's happened to us, and it's a lot easier if you plan and prepare. So skills. My point in saying that is we had no skills directly correlated to this industry. We didn't know anything about trucks. We didn't know anything about maintenance. We didn't know anything about driving the trucks. We didn't even have the appropriate certifications. As I said, the commercial driver's license is a particular type of license that you had to get. I didn't even know how to drive a manual vehicle, a manual stick shift. Now, for those of you that are relatively young, you might not even know what that is, but 20 years ago, 15, 20 years, however long ago it was, there were a lot of vehicles on the road that were manual. When I was growing up, my parents had a Geo Metro. I don't think they exist anymore, but that's where the majority of my brothers and sisters learned how to drive a stick shift. I never learned that. So when we got our first roll-off truck, not only was it a manual, but it was a double clutch, 8-speed roll-off truck. So I had no skills in this industry, is what I'm trying to get at. Take a step back. Think about yourself. Think about those around you. If you have these conversations with your friends because you hang out with like-minded individuals who are entrepreneurs or want to be entrepreneurs, what are your skill sets? That can often help determine what might be a good fit for you in terms of what you attempt or what you, not attempt, but what you ultimately end up trying to get into, what business you start. When you take a step back and you look at your skills, I often find it helpful to ask the people around you who know you the best. If I was going to start a business, what do you think my skills are? What do you think I would be good at? This sounds really simple and really basic, but it's often forgotten. Just thinking about, well, where do my skills, my naturally inherited abilities, or the abilities that I've honed over the first, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30, 35, 40, 45 years of your life, wherever you're starting your entrepreneurial journey, where do they best align? I often find it helpful to think about in the common nomenclature of extrovert versus introvert. Now, I've never been a real big fan of categorizing people into those two particular buckets, but for purposes of understandability, since we're all familiar with, generally speaking, the skill set of an extrovert versus the skill set of an introvert, I find it helpful to utilize that as a foundation upon which to talk about skills. So briefly, extroverts are typically also known as type A personalities, pretty strong-willed, pretty communicative, more outgoing, enjoy talking to people. They get their battery recharged by being around people and being in social settings. Juxtapose that with introverts, people who typically listen more than they talk. Being in a social setting is a lot of work and it takes a lot of effort. It's not something that they particularly enjoy. And to recharge their battery, they'd rather just be alone and reading a book or watching some TV and just having some personal time. There's a lot more qualities between those two, but let's just start with that. If you're an introvert, it's not likely that your skills will be a good fit for a communications role, starting a communications business, starting a podcast, being a radio host. They just don't necessarily jive. I'm not saying that you can't, and I'm not saying that it's impossible. We're having a conversation about what are the things that you can lay out and think about that will give you the highest level of success. And if you get into a business that is almost diametrically opposed to what your skill sets are, I believe anything's possible, but it makes it a lot harder. And business is hard enough on its own. Talking about skills, we heard from Alex, the car dealer, that he grew up around cars. He knew everything about cars. And so he was really comfortable in an environment where you were talking about cars. And so ultimately, what did he end up doing? He started a car dealership. He had certain moral underpinnings that he believed he could bring to the table in that industry. Honesty, integrity, knowing the cars really well, not paying salespeople on commission, which of course at that time, and as he said, was completely contrary to everything everybody told him he would have to do to be successful. And so far, he's been incredibly successful. So with the skill set combined with his moral upbringing, he was able to do something that worked out well for him. If you're someone that maybe you're a hairstylist and you want to start a salon, you've probably got gifts and skills in working with people's hair, something completely out of my bailiwick. If I went to try to start a hair salon, it'd probably be on fire within the first day. Number one, that is not anything I enjoy. And number two, my skill sets don't align. Now, I could bring up a ton more examples, but I think you get the point. Think about your skills and then ask the others around you, what are your skills? And that can help to form the foundation or the scope of industries that you can narrow potential opportunities for you to start a business in. Tying on to that, I want to add, and this is what I say I caveat it with, what you enjoy. There's this belief in society that do what you love and everything else will work out. I don't subscribe to that philosophy. I think that philosophy is far too simplistic. And I think that in order to do what you love, truly enjoy, so it doesn't feel like you're going to work every day, you might have to go through some pain. You might need to start in something that you don't particularly enjoy, become successful in that, and then you will have a financial foundation and a foundation or skill set of business to do what you love. A perfect example is I didn't particularly enjoy garbage. As a matter of fact, the more we got into the industry, the more I realized I disdained garbage. It was smelly. In the summer, it's hot. And when your trucks break down and you can't pick up people's trash, people get really angry and they yell at you over the phone. And I understand, because when it's 105 degrees out and it's humid and your trash didn't get picked up because your truck broke down and you still have 100 customers to go and it's 7 o'clock at night, people are wondering why their trash didn't get picked up. And I could go on and on and on about that particular industry. And anybody that's been in an industry understands what I'm talking about. And so while I didn't enjoy trash, I wouldn't be able to do anything I'm doing today. I wouldn't have been able to start this podcast. I wouldn't be able to be in the industries that I'm in right now that I enjoy 100 times more than that first industry that I was in, had I not put my head down, focused, and gotten into an industry that actually, unbeknownst to any planning or preparation that Jeff and I did, was the perfect industry for us to get in, to be able, from a financing perspective, from a funding your business perspective, by operations, from a growth perspective, and from a salability perspective. My point in saying this is I do want everybody at some point, if you're going to be an entrepreneur, to be able to be in a position where you can say, I don't feel like I'm working because I'm getting up every single day doing something I genuinely enjoy. But that doesn't mean it's always going to be your first business. And it doesn't mean that that can happen right away. Sometimes you've got to be patient. You've got to have grit and perseverance and be successful in something else before you can really have the foundation, whether financially or an experiential foundation or the connections perhaps, to do what you really enjoy. So the reason I caveat that is think about your skills, and if your skill set happens to align well in a particular industry that you also enjoy, that's the magic kingdom. That's an excellent recipe or foundation for possible success. But that's not always going to be the case. And just because you don't 100% enjoy something, but you have a skill set that would give you a really high degree of success or a pretty solid degree of success, that's okay. That doesn't mean you'll never be able to do what you enjoy. The other reason I caveat that is sometimes you have a hobby and you enjoy that, but once it becomes your job, you basically turn something you enjoyed into something you hate. And you don't want to do that because everybody has hobbies and everybody wants to maintain those hobbies and continue to enjoy those hobbies. And if you take a hobby and turn it into a business and you ultimately end up hating it, that's not a positive outcome. Now, some people have hobbies and they turn that into a business and they love it. And the admiration and the enthusiasm they have for that hobby helps them be even more successful in their business because they have a genuine interest in what they're trying to, the business in which or the industry in which they're trying to operate. Skills and enjoyment. Think about your skills. If you're a relatively mechanically inclined individual and tinkering comes relatively easy for you, perhaps getting in some type of product development industry would work well for you. If you're an engineering-minded individual, perhaps trying to think about inventions or things outside the box would be great opportunities for you. My skill set was always primarily in the financial services industry, and I went to school for accounting, and as I've said, I'm a CPA. And while I don't particularly enjoy doing accounting every single day, what I can tell you is every single business benefits from an understanding of the basics of financial statements, of the basics of revenue, of the basics of expenses, of the basics of accounts receivable, accounts payable, cash flow. How do you finance a business? And so I was very blessed in the sense that I thoroughly enjoy the fundamental aspects of accounting and finances, not necessarily doing the day-to-day all the time, but I've done plenty of it. And so I was able to take that skill set, be successful in an industry, the garbage service industry, that I wasn't particularly excited about, grow it, sell it, get a nice base of capital to now move on to other businesses that I'm more excited about. I have a high-end furniture making company, King's Woodshop, that I'm doing with my brother. We have a construction company in a couple different locations. And while I'm not technically inclined, meaning I'm not a very good builder, my brother, Caleb, is awesome at it. And we'll have him on the podcast, and he's going to be doing a few guest hosts of the podcast because he's been there with me from the very beginning, the thick and the thin of it. And he can talk as much about entrepreneurial success and failures and struggles as I can. And I very much look forward to those podcasts. But that's a perfect example where we have companies where my skill sets are great on the financial side, the marketing side, the operations side. His skill sets are the complete opposite. And they're really good on a technical side, making, creating, and engineering, a mathematic-minded individual. When you combine those two things, it gives us that much better of an opportunity to be successful in whatever company that we're trying to operate. Now, that's a topic for a whole nother podcast. Number one, getting into business with family. And number two, having a business partner whose skills complement your skills. And together, you get the full package. And we've talked in a few previous podcasts about having business partners, whether you should, whether you shouldn't. And again, a whole nother podcast. There are lots of aptitude tests you can take out there for what your skills are. If you sit down, I've heard this before, well, I'm not good at anything. Well, that's not true. Everybody is good at something. And if you're not sure what you're good at, I know that you can talk to your family and friends, and they'll probably start with what you're bad at and what your skills aren't, because in society we like to focus on our weaknesses or point them out of other people. But they'll also be able to help you think through what are your strengths. And once you've done that, once you've put that on paper, if you're still not sure where to go, email me, andrew@andrewsholland.com, and say, hey, these are all my skills. What do you think would be a good industry or business for me to think about starting? Now, we're only on number 1 out of 5 of the factors that I want to talk about today. But once you've got a good list of skills down, I think that will narrow down the possible businesses that may be a good fit for you to take action on and to start establishing roots to start. Talking about the enjoyment, again, let's say that you are someone that's relatively detail-oriented, you follow instructions well, and you really thoroughly enjoy cooking. There may be some opportunity there. Now, let's talk about that specific industry. Being a chef is very challenging. You likely have to go to school for a chef, a culinary school. And there are some industries where you cannot get into, and again, I say the word cannot hesitantly, but I'm going to say the word cannot get into without having higher education for that specific industry. A doctor, that's obvious. A chiropractor, that's obvious. A dentist, again, obvious. If your skill set or your enjoyment falls in those categories, you're blessed. That's fantastic. Those are pretty easy paths. And when I say easy, I don't mean in the sense that they're not a lot of work. I just mean, okay, you don't have to think long and hard, and you don't have to sit back and say, boy, what business should I start? I like dentistry. I've always wanted to be a dentist. I'm going to go to dental school. I'm going to be a hygienist. Then I'm going to be a dentist. Then I'm going to start my own private practice. And you go from there. You probably don't necessarily have the struggle of, what should I start? Now, having said that, some people are really, really good at being a dentist, and maybe they're not fulfilled and they want to get out of that and into something else. Well, then you can go through this list of criteria that we're talking about. Want to go on to number 2, and that's financing. This, of course, is the scariest part of business. How are you going to finance it? How am I going to afford this? How can I live 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 to 5 years, not bringing in any income, and quite the opposite, putting money into a business? How am I going to support a family? Those are all incredibly important questions to ask prior to going into business. And you're not always going to have a 100% answer, but you should have a plan and you should have thought about it. When Jeff and I got into the garbage business, we didn't have any money. Neither of us came from money. And as I said earlier in this podcast and in previous podcasts, we financed the original truck and 18 dumpsters that we bought on credit cards. That eventually became very painful because, as we all know, credit cards can get very, very expensive. And so that is not the way that you want to finance a business, especially not to the tune of $90,000, which is about what it was for us back in 2010 to buy a truck and 18 dumpsters. And that was a really good deal at the time because we had just gone through the great financial crisis and a lot of construction companies were going out of business. So what we didn't realize is getting into the industry in which we were getting into was a very asset-driven industry. Obviously, we knew we had to buy assets and we need to have assets. But one of the beautiful things about that is they're hard assets. They're easily financeable. If you start a tech company and the basis for your revenue is software, and you need $50,000 to $100,000 to build software before you can generate $1 in revenue, and this software is code, that is very hard for bankers and for our current financial system to wrap its head around and say, I see the potential in this. I'm going to loan you money against this piece of software. Our financial system isn't set up very well for financing what I consider non-hard asset based industries. Technology is one of those industries. Software is one of those industries. Whereas something like real estate, and one of the reasons so many people like to get into real estate is not only because it's fascinating and you has a hard asset that you can enjoy and remodel and rent out and what have you, but because it's relatively probably the easiest asset or industry to get financing in. Again, setting aside the turbulent markets within the real estate industry like 2008 and 2009, which was virtually impossible to get financing in that industry, especially if you were just getting into it. But in the broader scheme of things, long term, real estate is a relatively solid business to start and finance because bankers and our system is well set up to say, yeah, you've got a property, let's get an appraisal, appraise it at $100,000. I'm going to give you a 70% loan to value, meaning they're going to give you $70,000. You've got to come in with $30,000. They're going to give you the other $70,000. So for us in the garbage service industry, it was very similar to real estate. Now, the loan to values that we got, and again, loan to value simply means your loan amount to the value of the underlying asset. So like I just talked about in the real estate example, if the house, let's say you were looking to buy an apartment building. Let's say it costs $100,000. You go to the banker and say, hey, I want to buy this fourplex, and here's my business plan, and here's how it's going to cash flow. I've got all the income statements prepared. Can I get a loan? He's going to look at it and say, you know what? Let's get an appraisal. Let's verify that value of $100,000. Yeah, we'll give you a loan to value of 75% on that. That means he's going to give you a $75,000 loan to the value of $100,000 for the fourplex. Loan to value is 75%. So that's called your loan to value ratio, coverage ratio. There's multiple terms for it, but loan to value is pretty common. So for us, while the loan to value denominators or ratios or coverages maybe weren't as optimistic in the garbage industry as they would be in real estate, meaning if we had a $100,000 asset, they would only give us $60,000. So the loan to value, the max loan to value they would go up to was 60%. It was still a hard asset that bankers could get their minds around and feel comfortable that if the business went belly up, we had a hard asset that we could go out and sell to pay off the loan. That's something that's really important to think about when you are considering what business to start or what industry to get into. Hard assets versus soft assets. I'm going to use the word soft assets. If you're thinking about starting a cooking company, what is the business model going to be and what specifically are you going to start? If you want to sell cooking books, let's say, you're not going to find a financier who's very excited to finance your cooking books. Well, I'm writing these books and I'm going to publish them and I'm going to sell them for $10 each and I have 1,000 books, so I'm going to make $10,000 and you can just use these books as collateral if my loan goes belly up or if I can't afford to pay. You get the point. They're not going to use books as collateral. I'm going to go back because it's the most obvious to the software, the technology industry. Again, it's really, really, really hard to finance software. Now, as we've gotten into the 21st century, there's all sorts of financing companies that are out there, and there are financing companies that will specialize in particular industries and they know all the ins and outs. But we're talking about starting a new business. And of course, we recognize that a new business has a much higher risk level of in terms of the likelihood of failure is a lot higher. So even some of these financing companies that will do software packages, it's going to be really, really stringent financing, maybe 30%. They'll finance 30% of $1 million software platform that you want to build, and you have to come up with the other 70%. So we got, I'm going to say lucky, but really we were blessed that the industry that we got into, we were able to grow in spite of not having any money because we had hard assets that were easily and readily sellable should we not be able to pay on the loan. If you're thinking about starting a company, you need to think about those two aspects. Number one, how much money do you have to put into it yourself? And number two, how easily is it to get financing to grow? Those two things can easily be a determinant in which direction you go for your first business. Because being able to grow, if that's what you want, and if it requires a significant amount of capital that you don't have, you have two ways to get that capital. Equity, meaning money that you have, or people that are willing to give you money that you don't have to pay back but will take ownership in the company so that you can start and grow the business, or debt. And that can be debt from a typical financial institution where they'll give you money, keep your assets as collateral, and you have to pay it back over time. Or you can get debt, loans from friends, family, or unrelated individuals if you've grown a trust level with them and they're willing to finance it. You often hear about venture capital or private equity. And we talked briefly about this with Darren, and in the article that he had in the Entrepreneur magazine, he talked about this a lot. And as his industry, the audio industry, where they were developing a product and trying to patent a product, that can be very challenging to finance. But it was in the tech industry. And so you'll have a lot of venture capital companies or private equity companies, typically venture capital if it's a new business, that's the term that we would use, that will say, oh, we'll give you this much money for this percent of the company. It's almost always an equity type of situation. Very infrequently is it debt. And usually you basically give your firstborn, secondborn, and thirdborn in order to get that venture capital funding. Now I'm being extreme, but the point is just be very cautious when you're raising money about what you're getting versus what you're giving up. So if you're looking to be in a tech industry, or you want to develop video games, or again, you have some type of revolutionary software product that's going to change how we track inventory. I'm just throwing out examples. That's going to be a tough one to finance. And you need to think long and hard about what are your cash needs going to be to, number one, build the software if you don't have it built, or if you don't have the capability yourself to write the code to build it. And number two, to grow your business, to market it to people, to get it in front of people who will subscribe to it or buy it from you. What are your cash burn? You often hear about that in new businesses. Well, what's your cash burn? How much money are you going to need to survive until you get to profitability? Think about that before you make any decision into what specific business or industry you're going to start. Now, I'm not saying you have to have all of the answers to all of these questions. What I'm trying to do here is give you 5 key factors that I've learned from experience that have been extremely helpful for me, that I know that are extremely helpful to other entrepreneurs that I talk to, and that I know are extremely important given my background from accounting background, from being in banking, and from being a small business owner. I'm trying to give you these critical things that will really help you start planning and preparing on moving your mindset, getting a little bit less afraid of taking that leap, of talking about starting something, to actually taking action and starting something. This is supposed to help prepare you and get you in the mindset to think about, what can I start? And maybe you have an idea, and maybe right now you're going down a path and you're going to listen to this and you're going to think, wait a minute, these are really good factors that I haven't considered. Had you talked to me at year 1 or 2 in the garbage business and asked me about these things, I'm not sure I know what I would have said. I would have said, boy, I'm not sure. I didn't think about any of those things. Now, again, we were really blessed in the financing area. Had our industry that we got into not been as readily financeable as it was, we would have been dead. Plain and simple. End of story. Would have been over. So that was something that worked out well to our advantage. The other thing about hard assets is, and the industry we were in, I'm going to make a general statement. Those can be more easily saleable than a software asset, unless if on the software side of things, you have high revenue. The software itself doesn't have value, but the revenue generation capability is what derives its value. Whereas with real estate, of course, you should be thinking about it from a cash flow perspective. You often think about a cap rate, and I don't want to dive too much into that, but that's the return you can expect to receive on the real estate. But the real estate itself, because it's a hard asset, and I know I'm saying that a lot, but it's important to make that distinction when you're thinking about what business you might want to start. But because it's a hard asset, it has intrinsic value unto itself without generating any particular cash flow. I'm not saying that's how you should think about investment real estate, but the reason that's important is because in America, one of the number one assets of the majority of people, the middle class, is their home. Now, I'm not saying that's a good or a bad thing, but that is a fact just based on the underlying concept of intrinsic value of real estate. It doesn't need to be generating revenue to have value, whereas with something like a software platform, that's what its value is going to be derived from. I'm going to move on to number 3 and 4, and I'm going to talk about those two kind of in combination. And of course, like any good entrepreneur or any good businessman, we talk about what we know in our experiences. One of the things that I didn't think about was the location where I was when I started a business. I was living in Wisconsin, living in the Midwest. And while I'm very thankful I grew up in the Midwest for many, many reasons, you've heard of Midwest Nice, for the ethics, the morals, the work ethic, just the Midwest Nice aspect, and my heart will always be there. That will always be home. I did not realize how much I hated the weather. Winter, cold, frigid, freezing temperatures. And while I knew I despised the weather there, it wasn't until I got into an industry whose primary operations were outside, whose primary assets, the trucks, basically hated cold weather. Lines freeze, trucks break down, maintenance is a nightmare. Cold weather just does not do a lot of favors to large equipment. And you talk to anybody that operates in a cold climate in an industry that has heavy equipment and machinery, and they'll tell you that, let's use the Midwest as an example, the months of January and February are miserable because either A, you completely shut down because your equipment doesn't work, you can't even get it started in the morning, or B, trying to keep the equipment up takes up 95% of your time because it just doesn't work very well in cold climates. So when Jeff and I got into this business, I didn't take even 2 steps to think about, is this where I want to be long term? Am I happy personally living here? Now, all my family was there at the time. And so, of course, I couldn't have done the business without my family. And the city we were in was relatively small. So that worked to our advantage in so many ways, particularly from a marketing perspective, because our marketing environment was much less costly to do mass marketing than it would have been in a larger location, such as the Twin Cities, Minneapolis, and St. Paul. And one of the largest campaigns we did was a radio advertising campaign. And we wouldn't have been able to afford that campaign, which brought us a tremendous amount of success had we been in a larger media market. But I didn't think about the location in which we were starting a business and if that's where I wanted to be long term. And that really started to wear on me mentally year 5, 6, 7 in the business. And business itself is already challenging enough. So to be doing a business that you're not particularly excited about in an area that you really hate, and again, not because of the people, not for any other reason other than the weather. And for those of you who are hot-blooded individuals, meaning you love the heat, which is why I'm in Arizona now, you understand what I'm talking about. I know people that are just the opposite. They hate the heat. I would argue that my brother, well, he's probably in between, but he would much rather have not heat, especially if you're working outside, like in construction, than freezing cold temperatures, although there's huge disadvantages to that. And we've got a lot of stories on the construction side of things when we had our construction company in Wisconsin. But the point saying is business is hard enough. So when you add that element of, in my particular case, I couldn't stand the location because of weather, it makes it that much harder. So the reason I believe that's an important consideration when you're thinking about what you want to start, and this goes along with number 4, location-based businesses versus anywhere businesses. If you're going to start a business that is location-based, meaning, again, a retail shop, a restaurant, a destination where people have to come to you, or in my case, where your operations were based on door to door to door to door, picking up people's trash every day. You can't just open a new location in California and then one in Florida and then one in New York. Not saying over time you can't, because obviously waste management is everywhere, but that took years and years and years and years. But the ability to grow, you start organically where the original headquarters are, and then you typically grow out from there in a location-based business. So if you are a location-based business and you're operating in a business or a location that you aren't personally satisfied with, or you don't know that that's going to be your long-term or your forever location, for whatever reason, it could be you just don't like the people there. It could be you don't like the culture there. It could be you don't like the weather there. It could be you don't like how remote it is. It could be that you don't like how busy it is and how many people there are. There's a million reasons that we all decide to like or dislike locations. But for whatever reason, if you're operating a location-based business in a location that you aren't fond of, it makes things that much more difficult. Now, if you're in a location that you aren't particularly fond of, but you're operating a anywhere business, meaning something that perhaps primarily transacts across the internet, whether it's a blog, whether you're running an Amazon type company where you're doing nothing but drop shipping, so you never physically interact with the product, or essentially a business that can be done anywhere, it's not so bad because you can get up and move from that location wherever you want. And perhaps there's other reasons keeping you in that location. Primarily, family is one of the primary determinants of where we live. And I think that's an extremely important factor to consider, of course. There's all sorts of other reasons. It's where our friends are. It's where we grew up. So maybe we're afraid to leave, and that can be a bad thing or a good thing. It depends. But if you're operating a anywhere-based business in a location that you don't particularly enjoy, not a big deal. If you're operating a location-based business in a location you don't enjoy, not so good. On the contrary, if you're in a location that you really enjoy, I'm in Arizona. I love Arizona. I love everything about Arizona. The only thing Arizona doesn't have is an ocean, but the ocean is about 5 hours away. So if I get a craving to go to the ocean with my nieces and nephews and my family, we go there and we satisfy that craving, if you will. There's no winter, and that makes me very, very happy. So if I was going to operate a location-based business here, great. It's where I know I want to be long term. And so if I'm operating an anywhere business, again, the location is less important, and maybe you don't know where you want to be long term, and so it's easier to jump around. So the 5 factors were on 3 and 4. 3 being location that you want to be in, you and your family want to be in. Number 4, closely linked, but a location-based business versus a service-based business. I want to focus a little bit. I think I've made my point on location where you want to be. I think I've made, and that may change over time. And if that does change over time, and you're in a location-based business, perhaps you're somewhere and you're living there for 10 to 15 years, and this happens a lot to families in the Midwest, quite frankly. I'm not sure about couples or that basically start a company elsewhere, but I know a lot of people that moved out of the Midwest and they maybe went to the East Coast or the West Coast, put all their families back home, and then they have kids and they want to go back where their family is. So they have grandma and grandpa and the support system as you're raising a family. That makes a lot of sense. So if you start a business in that scenario, if you move and you start a business outside of where your long-term location is going to be, you're going to have challenges, either moving the business or maybe you want to sell the business. So all things to think about when you are considering starting a business. Location-based businesses versus anywhere-based businesses. If you're someone who needs to travel, if you're someone who cannot stay put for an extended period of time, it goes without saying that having a location-based business is probably not going to jive very well with your personal desires. Now, that's not to say that you can't be successful in a location-based business, but again, if you're someone needs to be moving and shaking and traveling all the time, or maybe your spouse or significant other want to be traveling all the time, and you're thinking about starting a business, it's important that you have that conversation about having a location-based business. Because I can tell you, if you're married and you start a business, a location-based business, and you're fine with that, but your spouse is not, and they want to be traveling all the time, that is going to put stress either on the relationship or the business is going to suffer. Just inherently, that's how it's going to be. So if you have the opportunity to think about these things, to talk with the people that are most important around you as you're thinking about what business you want to go into, location-based businesses versus anywhere-based businesses are extremely important. Now, there comes a time if you have a location-based business and you grow and you've had it for 10 to 15 years and you've established a good team of individuals and managers that you can trust and employees that are doing a great job, where you're going to have more freedom and flexibility. But the context in which we're talking today is all about what are things to think about to make it easier to make that first jump into your entrepreneurial endeavor. So you're talking about the beginning of a business. And if it's location-based, you're probably not going to be able to be away from it. And ask anybody that is in business who has a location-based business. You can't just jump away from the business for 1, 2, 3, 4 weeks and not have an impact the business. It just doesn't happen, especially if you're just starting out. So think about that. Now, if you want a business, if your skill set and everything we talked about align well with a business that can be an anywhere business, let's say you're a public speaker, let's say a consulting business, so much since the pandemic can be done over Zoom in the consulting world. Now, I'm a big believer in human-to-human interaction, traveling to clients. I just don't believe you get the same results overall, no matter what industry you're talking about, when you don't have physical interaction and you don't actually see humans face to face and everything is electronic. Not to say that some of it can't be electronic, but I'm a big believer that meeting people in person, shaking their hands, getting dinner, just growing that relationship is so key to being successful, regardless of what industry you're in. But let's say you're in an industry that's less location based, and it can really be done from any country, anywhere, because it's primarily, in those situations, typically an internet based business. And again, that doesn't mean you can't be selling goods and services, but or goods rather. It just means that you don't have to be physically located in one particular area. There's lots of people that have Amazon companies where they're selling goods. And the reason I'm saying this is typically we think about anywhere based businesses as services, just services that can be provided across the internet: consulting, marketing, writing, blogging, influencers, attorney work, although depending on the type of legal law you practice, if it's in court, obviously that can be challenging because that's more location based, and based on licenses. But my point saying is we often think about services as the ones that are primarily anywhere, operate anywhere type businesses, but that's not true. There's lots of goods businesses that can be operated from anywhere. If you have a drop shipping company, that's a perfect example of something like that. So service business tend to lend themselves better, depending on the service, to being an anywhere type business. But there's lots of services that aren't. Hair salon, you can't cut people's hair over the internet, and that's a service-based business. So we could go down that same path. Point of saying all of this is another factor to consider when you're thinking about what should I get into. If you can decide, not only for yourself, but for those that are important to you and overall your personal desires and goals for the business, would I be better off in a location-based business or a business that I can operate from anywhere? I think that will go a long way to helping you be successful in whatever business you choose. If all 5 of these things we're talking about, and we'll talk about the last one here, which is a little bit different than the other ones, because we're going to talk about scalability, but it's important because it helps you think about what you want for the business long term, and it gets you to start thinking years in advance, seeing the forest from the trees. If all 5 of these things align, that's a beautiful thing. If you can find an industry that works well, my skills match up, I enjoy it. If that happens to work out and it's something that you feel confident on, and of course you can never know if you take a hobby and bring it to business, you can never really know whether that's going to make you hate that hobby or whether you're going to enjoy it. So sometimes you just have to try to know. The financing side of things, location, where you are, your location based versus anywhere type business, and then last, scalability. If those 5 things align and you found an industry where it works, that's fantastic. It very infrequently happens where all of those are going to align. And so I want you to be aware of it. But that's not to say that you can't make it happen, especially when you're starting off. The more of these align, the better. We all know that many businesses, I don't remember the percentages, 65%, 70% fail within the first year. 90% fail within the first 3 years. I don't remember all the statistics, but so if you can take factors out that contribute to those failures, then your probability of success goes up. And that's what we're trying to accomplish today, is thinking about how we can take that first step and give ourselves the best opportunity for success. Now, there's always going to be external factors that come along that you can't consider or you aren't aware of, and there's a lot more considerations outside of these 5. These are just 5 really important ones that I have found in my experience, and as I said, talking to other entrepreneurs, that I think are crucial when you're thinking about what should you get into. The last thing that I want to talk about, scalability. The scalability of a business can become really important as you get into the business because, for me, I have found that when you're in a business, and let's say you enjoy it, but it is not meeting your personal growth goals, and it's not growing as quickly as you want it to. We always want it to grow faster, but it doesn't even have the capability to grow as quickly as you want it to. That can be really frustrating. And so I want you to think about, what do you want with your business? If you're a hairstylist, and I use that example because it satisfies so many of these different things. There's people that have that skill set and people that enjoy it. It's not one of mine, but it's an easily understood skill set in business. Growing that can be challenging because it's a location-based business, which can make it challenging. Because anytime you're a location-based business, you have to open up new shops. That means it's more capital intensive because you either have to buy the real estate or you have to lease. Whereas if you have, again, I refer to this because it's such a good juxtaposition to a location, a software, well, the software's on a computer. Anybody can download it, anybody can pay for it, and the world is basically your oyster. Anybody can use it. Now, niches get riches. So typically software that focuses on one particular industry and then you focus on customers in that industry do the best. But the growth or the scalability factor is that much easier. And that's often the case when you think about a location-based business versus a anywhere type business. A business that is primarily generates its revenue across the internet, generally speaking, and there's always exceptions, has what I would consider a higher scalability factor than a retail-based business. And why did the franchise model come to exist? What's the franchise model? So let's take McDonald's, for example, Dunkin' Donuts. And I've shared with you in the past that one of my favorite pastimes when I have the opportunity is to watch documentaries. And so as I've shared in the past, I've been watching a history documentary. I've completed actually, I think there's still another season for me to watch, but The Food That Built America. And it talks about a lot of the franchises that we all know and how they were established. It also talks about how they grew. Well, food-based establishments are primarily location-based, and that means they're more capital intensive to grow. So what you found is, and I don't remember who originally came up with the franchise model, but essentially you use other people's money to grow your business. Why? Because if you're going to grow from 1 location to 2 locations to 5 locations to 10 locations to 100 locations, spread out across, let's just take the West Coast, not only is that challenging from a financing perspective, but location-based businesses, that means you got to be traveling everywhere. Ray Kroc, famously known for buying McDonald's from the McDonald brothers and turning it into what we know McDonald's is today, basically was traveling 95% of the time to every single location. If he had to travel to every single location and own all of them with his own money, it basically could have been impossible because that's expensive to do. So when you think about scalability, I own a bike and coffee shop with one of my business partners. And he and I often have the conversation, his name is Adam, we often have the conversation about growing. What do we want from this business? How do we grow the business? Do we want to focus on online sales? Do we want to focus on retail sales? Those are 2 very different methods of growth. And the scalability factors for each one of those is different. If we're going to grow locations, that is a lot more challenging than if we're going to focus on online sales. Now, the beauty is in this day and age, you can do both. But what we're finding, and look at the retail industry. I mean, I don't want to say retail is dead, but retail, malls, they're dead. Until malls, and I think you're seeing this across the country, move from simply a goods-based model where people are coming in to buy goods to more of an experiential model where people are coming there for experiences. And you're seeing this change in what were the large mall scenes where they're getting more experience-based businesses because the goods-based model is all shifting to the internet. Those big stores are expensive. And when you have competitors that have no overhead, no fixed cost, big buildings that, not only cost money to build, but electricity and all the maintenance, you almost have to. Competition dictates that you move more of your goods-based business to sales on the internet. That's not to say location-based businesses are dead, but I think everybody understands retail is shifting to the internet, has been for a long time, and I think we're only going to see that growth. So you want to talk about some of the industries, I'm diverging a little bit, but logistics. I think trucking and logistics, there's just a huge opportunity for that as we continue to move into the 21st century, into the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. And that's why you see Amazon investing tremendously in their logistics business. And again, I know I'm diverging, but part of this podcast is to talk about the relevant topics of the day that relate to what we're saying. UPS has huge contracts with Amazon. Well, if I was UPS, and I'm sure their management is aware of this, sometimes management can't see the forest from the trees, so it may not be the case, but I'd be stunned if they aren't. It's no secret to me, and I don't think it's going to be surprised when Amazon says, okay, we can handle all of our own delivery business. Goodbye, UPS. And I don't know what portion of Amazon's business, UPS business is accounted for from revenue from Amazon, but I imagine it's a pretty large portion. And so if that just went away and they didn't have an alternative revenue model to make up for that lost revenue, they're going to be hurting. The point in saying this is I think there's an opportunity in logistics as we move forward because so many of what were typically location-based businesses are moving to retail. But getting back to the location-based, when we think about in our businesses scaling, we often have to have that conversation. Do we want to grow on the internet? And do we want to grow our retail locations? And there's a lot of businesses where both are the factor. I read a great article the other day for Untuckit. And Untuckit, if you're not familiar with who they are, they're basically a men's fashion wear brand that found an opportunity in the marketplace for people that wanted to wear professional clothing, but they didn't always want to have to tuck their shirts in. But the shirts that were currently on the market were far too long, so it looks silly if you didn't tuck your shirts in. Their founder, whose name escapes me at the moment, said, you know what? I think there's a market need for shirts and I believe it started with guys and now they've shifted into women's wear as well, but I still believe guys is the larger portion of their business model. But the article talked about how it was really important for them to use the retail-based model and get in high-end malls exactly where they wanted to be. Now, they're certainly selling things over the internet, but they found huge success, I would say an anomaly, in a retail-based industry that has primarily been moving to the online world, but they found huge success in retail-based locations, strategically based locations, but location-based revenue opportunities nonetheless. So when we're talking about these things, they're all broad-based, and you always have to think about what specifically you're doing and what does your business model look like. But the scalability factor is something you should think about. If you're going to do an anywhere-based business, it typically means it's an internet business, which means your scalability factor is probably higher. And when I say that, I mean the potential to scale rapidly is higher than if you're in a location-based business where scaling rapidly is much more challenging, both just physically, it's impossible to open up 50, not impossible. It's challenging to open up 30 new locations, and financially, it's very challenging. So when you're thinking about what you want to get into, think about what you want for the business. How big do you want it to grow? If you're happy with 1 or 2 locations, you're happy with a location-based business, you've gone through these 5 factors, your skill sets align, and all the other factors, you're good with location, you're good where you live, you're good with a location-based business, you have the financing to maybe finance a building, or you have someone who's going to help you, and you just want to have 1 or 2 shops, fantastic. That's great. Nothing wrong with that whatsoever. If you're someone that's very ambitious and you want to grow, well, then think about what industry you're going to operate in. And that's not to say that you can't grow in the location-based business. And going back to franchises, I kind of diverged from that before, but the franchise model started because they wanted to grow, and they wanted to grow quickly and open new locations, but they didn't have the money themselves. And so they said, okay, we're just going to license the business model out to other people, and they'll pay us a fee to do so. So Ray Kroc says, I've got this business model down. You've got to follow all of these. We have to have consistency across our location, but I'm going to license these products and this name. You can use it. You have to have a certain net worth, and you have to buy the building or finance the building or lease the building and pay for that. and you will just pay us a franchise fee on your revenues every single year. And it can be month, it can be yearly, and franchise agreements can be very long and complex. So you always want to read them before you get into it. But that allowed businesses like McDonald's and Taco Bell and Burger King and Dunkin' Donuts and Starbucks. I don't know if Starbucks is a franchise. I don't think they are, actually. I think that's all corporate. But specifically franchise-based businesses to grow more rapidly using other people's capital and just earn a fee on top of it. And they chose that model because they wanted to grow quickly, and the way to get around the financial burden of growing quickly in a location-based business and the logistical burden was to have people across the country who already lived in those locations just basically buy their business model from them and their products and start it themselves. We've covered a lot of ground. I've talked about a lot today, but I believe that if you are someone who is uncertain of what are the next moves for you to take to actually make that fear-inducing, traumatizing jump of starting into an entrepreneurial endeavor, thinking about, planning, and preparing around the 5 things that we've talked about today will be instrumental in helping you get more comfortable around making that leap of faith. And not only that, but as I've shared with you, if you've thought through some of these things, it will make your life that much easier year 1, year 2, year 3, year 4 of the business. Again, as I said, Jeff and I thought through none of these things when we started the business, literally none of them. And some of these things worked out to our advantage and some of them didn't. And we just had to put our heads down, deal with it because we hadn't planned and prepared for it, and move through. And again, it ultimately turned out extremely successful for us, but it did make it a lot harder because we didn't think through some of these things. That's all the time that we have for this week's episode. If you haven't listened to some of the other episodes, particularly the episode last week with Darren Nakonechny from Flock Audio, episode 9, the audio technician, please do so. It was a great conversation. We had a guest, Benson, his parrot, who's really one of the foundational aspects of his business, join us. Take time to do that. Listen to this episode if you're trying to figure out what you can start. And again, the whole point of this podcast is, and the reason I started it, was to be a support group of like-minded individuals who can talk with each other every week. Obviously, I'm primarily the one talking on the podcast, but we can connect on Twitter, A. Holland Podcast. Go to my website, theandrewhollandpodcast.com. Send me an email if you have questions. I hope in the next few months to launch a members-only access area on the website where we're going to start a blog where anybody that's a member can talk with each other. We can all talk with each other about anything that's on our mind from a business perspective. When that comes out, I'm just trying to build out the infrastructure. And like many entrepreneurs, I have a lot of things on my plate, so I don't get to make as much progress on it as I would like running other businesses. But when I launch that, I'll let you know. Let's continue to communicate. This podcast only exists because of you, the listener. If there's things you want me to do differently, there's guests you want me to have on, if you're someone who's been successful or is struggling and want to be a guest on the podcast, reach out to me, email me. That's the point of this podcast, and this podcast is only as good as we collectively make it together. Thank you so much for joining us this week. As always, just a reminder, this is a financial and a business podcast. We talk about many different topics. I give a lot of advice, talked a lot about a lot of things today. Don't take anything specifically that you hear in a podcast and apply it directly to your situation, particularly in the realms of financial services or financial aspects and legal aspects. Always make sure you consult the appropriate professionals for your specific situation so that you take the right steps when you're making any final decisions on some of those things. Thank you so much for joining us this week and every single Wednesday. I hope you have a great rest of your week, and we'll talk again next Wednesday. Thank you for listening to the Andrew Holland Podcast. Be sure to visit our website, theandrewhollandpodcast.com, for additional content on business, entrepreneurship, and everything in between. Subscribe to our YouTube channel, The Andrew Holland Podcast, to get notifications when new podcasts have been released. And lastly, follow us on Twitter, A Holland Podcast. That's A Holland Podcast for all the conversations we're having outside the podcast. Thanks again so much for joining us this week. Have a great day, and we'll talk again next week.